that sad little scrap of paper is?
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee. But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
All right. Hey, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that stirring rendition of I'm Just a Bill. Of course, this is Schoolhouse Rock, a classic video that describes the process by which a bill becomes a law. And of course, in order for a bill to become a law, it has to go through this convoluted, incredibly complicated political institution that we call the United States Congress. Today, we're going to be talking about Congress and, sort of what it is, how it works. And, I think there's a lot of detail here, so kind of get ready for that. But, the first thing I want to do just to start off is really think about how Congress is not a single institution in the United States. It's very complicated in that it's sort of like a nesting doll. It's got multiple institutions sort of contained within its confines. And I think the first way in which we can divide or subdivide this institution of Congress is, of course, to think about its bicameral structure. You may remember in the Genovian simulation that one of the big questions that we had to face was, are we developing a constitution that is going to have a unicameral or a single legislative chamber body, or are we going to have a legislature that is bicameral or even tricameral or some other kind of, extremely, complicated arrangement? In the U.S. system, of course, thanks to the Connecticut or the Great Compromise during the Constitutional Convention, we have this bicameral or two-chambered legislature. So that's the first way that we can think about that. The House of Representatives is, considered sort of the lower house, the larger, certainly house of the legislature in the United States. We can see here we have the Speaker of the House. We've got Nancy Pelosi here, who represents the Democrats, the majority party as of this recording in the House of Representatives. And we have Kevin McCarthy here, who represents the Republicans in the House of Representatives as the Republican or the minority party leader. So this is sort of the top partisan figureheads in the House of Representatives, and behind them are 435 members that are all representing a congressional district. And so we'll talk a lot more in future discussions about the lines that form districts and how those work, how those came to be. But we can generally think of these districts as being, pieces of states in the United States that comprise roughly 700 plus thousand people. And generally those lines are drawn in ways to make sure that there are the same number of people roughly in each congressional district. It's illegal to have congressional districts that have disproportionately way too many or way too few people. Now, of course, we know that different states, consider states like Wyoming, consider states like Alaska, have very small populations relative to larger states. Even Maryland is considered to be a pretty populous state. We've got about 6 million people despite our small geographic size. So compared to even some of its neighboring states, Maryland is larger, and so we are therefore afforded some more congressional districts to make up the composition of our population, to break that down into sort of these discrete 700,000 to 800,000 person chunks. Okay, so basically we have 435 divisions of those across the United States, and for each of those divisions we have one person that is tied geographically to represent that individual place. And so depending on which congressional district you happen to be in Maryland, say you're in the 1st, represented by Andy Harris, whichever district you may be in, right, that's going to be the representative who is purporting to represent you in Congress and tied to that specific region. I should also mention that in Maryland, we also have Steny Hoyer, who's actually a very important person in the House of Representatives, somebody who has a high level of seniority and who serves as the whip, essentially, for the Democrats, who's an important position who serves sort of under Nancy Pelosi in trying to make sure that Democrats pass Democratic legislation and they don't cross party lines or otherwise sort of misbehave by not taking the party line. So the whip system is also something that we can talk about later, but I just wanted to mention that in Maryland, our delegation is quite important. Of course, the late Elijah Cummings was also somebody with a lot of importance in the House of Representatives, soon to be replaced after an election, obviously, to be had very soon. So The Senate, however, is a little bit different. Okay, so we had this thing of the population-based House Representatives. In the Senate, we have 2 senators per state representing every state. So we have 100. You might be thinking to yourself, how do you pass laws, with an even-numbered body? Well, the Vice President of the United States is this highbreaker in the Senate. The Vice President is able to cast a tie-breaking vote in the event that there's a 50-50 tie. But essentially, we have 100 senators in the Senate. It's a smaller body. It only consists of that many people. We have here Chuck Schumer, who represents the Democrats, currently the minority party in the Senate. Here he is hammering a nail here. And of course, we have Mitch McConnell, who you may recognize from recent news items, certainly who represents the majority in the Senate right now, which is the Republicans. They have a slim majority in the Senate. And so in talking about these 2 legislative bodies, the House of Representatives, this larger sort of population-based solution, and the Senate, which is this state-based solution, right? The one that balances across the states, everybody gets the same amount of representation, no matter how small or large you are in terms of population. These obviously have been different bodies by virtue of their design and their sort of intent as the framers created them in an effort to balance or compromise in order to pass or ratify the Constitution across the small and large states during the Constitutional Convention. These legislatures are also quite different, I think partially because of their size, but I mean also because of the rules that have structured the debate that happens there over time. So if we think about the House, going back again to that larger body of 435 population-based representatives, debate in the House, imagine you're a member of the House of Representatives, you have a very limited time, essentially, in each legislative session to be able to actually speak in front of that whole House. And I mean, remember, think about this, right? Imagine that you were in a lecture class with 435 people in it, a giant auditorium, very, very large space. Of course, raising your hand and being that one student to say, hey, I have a question, you're unlikely to be able to get a tremendous amount of face time with a professor in a class like that. And so too is that true in the House. Generally, when stuff is being discussed in the House, there are rules that are dramatically limiting the amount to which one individual representative can actually speak. Where do these rules come from? Well, they come from precedent. They're largely based on the rules that have been carried forward across the ages. But really, I think the biggest thing to take away from this idea that the House is sort of such a crowded organization is that what we need to think about is the next sort of layer of the nesting dolls in this institution. We've gone from the entire legislative branch as defined in Article 1 of the Constitution. We've now gotten down to the House and the Senate. Now within each of those institutions, we're going to pop open another nesting doll, and we're going to find that there are all kinds of other smaller institutions within. And that's what we call the committee system, which exists in both the House and the Senate. For each of those, we pop open the doll, and we've got more institutions below. I think in the House, the committee system is especially important, again, because it's such a large body and there's just simply so many people. So if you're somebody who is serving in the House of Representatives, you are really motivated to try to serve on some of these standing committees, which are really where most of the details of legislation get hammered out in the House. So, for example, let's say that you're somebody who comes from a rural area where there's a lot of farming. You might be really excited about getting to serve on the Agriculture Committee. You might be, somebody maybe who comes from an area of Maryland, like, we've got Aberdeen Proving Grounds, we've got a lot of sort of military installations in Maryland. You might say, oh, I want to really, be part of the Veterans Affairs Committee, or, maybe I want to serve on the Armed Services Committee and have a say in some of the legislation that Congress is passing, some of these laws that pertain to these specific categories. So these committees, again, you can read more about them in the textbook. I don't want to go through all of them. But essentially, the idea is this is where most of these crucial sort of details of legislation are getting hammered out. We'll see in a later video sort of the how a bill becomes a law process. But for now, we want to think about the idea that these sort of sub-institutions within Congress, this is where a lot of the work happens as well. If you're a member of the House, if you're, again, a representative, and you're serving on one of these committees, this is where you're spending a lot of your time in hearings, in these committee meeting rooms, going over all the details of legislation, and critically providing oversight, as we'll talk about later. These are really, really important sub-institutions. Now, when we think about the rules of the House, like how the rules actually work in terms of when the entire body meets as 435 people, these rules are essentially determined on a bill-by-bill basis. And again, we think about this idea that essentially the rules for the House vary from extremely sort of tight and specific to a little bit less tight and specific. So often we have a thing called suspension of the rules, ironically, in which debate on the floor of the House is limited to just 40 minutes per issue. So I mean, think about 40 minutes. That's actually a very short amount of time. Actually, it's almost half of a regular meeting of Poly 100. Which, if you think about like important legislation that could impact the fate of the country, that's a very small amount of time to discuss on the entire floor of the House. Again, stressing the importance of the committee system, where a lot of those details, a lot of those long, lengthy, in-depth discussions are actually had. So again, when legislation gets brought to a vote, in many cases, it's been discussed almost not at all on the entire floor of the House. It's actually been mostly discussed in those committees, which stresses again the idea that if you're a member of the House of Representatives, you want to serve on the committees that are going to give you the most sort of input, because of course, why serve in Congress if you're not going to have any impact? Again, I just want to briefly go over some of these different kinds of rules that the House has, which really I think showcase the idea that this is an institution with very, very limited kinds of debate and discussion. So, for example, during open rules on the floor of the House, you can actually bring amendments. You can actually bring potentially changes to the bill. You can propose those changes, and as a representative, you get the chance to speak for an entire 5 minutes. Which, if you've ever done an in-class presentation, a 5-minute in-class presentation, you'll know that goes quite quickly, actually. Under structured rules, which again, the House leadership is going to determine this, including the Rules Committee. Amendments are going to be restricted to a narrow scope, which means that very little can be changed about these bills once they're being debated. And there's a pretty strict time limit for debate. Sometimes people will only get 1 minute to talk. And under closed rules, you might get a short amount of time to debate the bill, but no amendments at all can be introduced under closed rules. You're simply voting on the bill as it is, as it appears, as it's brought forth from committee, and that's pretty much all you get to do. So again, a lot of structure here. But if we compare this to the Senate, I think we get a feel for the idea that these are not two identical bodies whatsoever. These are two chambers with extraordinarily different sort of rules and practices. So in the Senate, I think the number one thing we can talk about, despite the difference in size, and of course the idea that the Senate is in some ways sort of the more impressive kind of magisterial body, right? Thought of as kind of the upper house of the United States. The Senate is especially unique because debate is unrestricted. Right? It's thought of as this great chamber for deliberation. So partially because there's only 100 people, although if you think about it, right, that's twice as many as an average section of Poly 100. That's actually quite a large number, nevertheless. But really, because of this smaller size and its unrestricted debate, the biggest thing to think about here when we think about the Senate is a thing called the filibuster. And the filibuster is essentially a practice by which a senator can continue speaking for as long as they want. They can hold the floor as long as they continue speaking, and it's one person. They can't tag team. They're able to speak for as long as they want. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, let's say I'm really passionate about an issue. Why would I care? Right? Why would I want to speak for 13 straight hours on an issue? In historical filibusters, senators have read from the phone book. They've read children's books, all kinds of stuff, to keep talking, right? To hold the floor. Why would I do this? Well, what it comes down to is, let's imagine that you are the minority party in the Senate. Let's imagine that you're somebody who is part of the party that does not have enough votes to pass legislation. Now, if you're one of those people currently in the Senate, that's the Democrats. In a previous Senate, as we'll see in just a moment, it was the Republicans. We would see an example of a piece of legislation being brought to the floor by the majority party. Right? The majority party would want, obviously, to pass bills, and so they would bring a piece of legislation, and they would know that they had enough votes to pass that on a simple majority. Right? In both of these chambers, to pass a bill, you need 50% of the senators or the representatives, depending on which chamber it is, to vote yay on the bill. And if that happens, then the bill will pass, and it will go on to the next step, as we'll talk about in later videos. Now, the thing is, if that's the case, and you know that this bill is going to pass without some intervention, one thing a senator could do is stand up there and literally block the ability of the Senate to conduct a vote by just talking as long as you possibly can until the bill expires, essentially, until the time limit for the consideration of the bill goes away. And so these filibusters often occur. They're sort of protests that happen by the minority party in a way that blocks legislation. The only way to stop one of these senators from talking until literally the bill expires is to override the filibuster. And historically, this is called a vote of cloture, and the rules of the Senate provide for it. But the rules require, essentially, that 3/5 or 60% of the senators, that's 60 out of the 100 senators, vote in favor of cloture. That is, basically, vote in favor of the motion to get the senator to shut up. And if that happens, then the senator has no recourse. They're actually, basically carted away, right? They're led away from the floor. No, they would generally step down and respect the vote of the Senate. They leave, and the vote can take place before expiration, and the bill will pass. However, what this means essentially, let's think strategically about this. Let's say that we've got 53 majority votes for a piece of legislation in the Senate. You've got 53 votes. That means that without a filibuster, the legislation would pass. But if the minority party, who has 47 votes, decides to filibuster, if they send up an intrepid senator to filibuster the vote, then that bill cannot pass as is, because you cannot actually vote on it. What you would need to do then is you would need to get 60 out of 100 people to vote in order to stop the filibuster and carry on with the vote, which again would then pass by a simple majority of 50%. But to get that 60, you would need to convince 7 other people, right? 53, which was your majority, plus 7 to vote for cloture, which means essentially that in the current context, let's say that the Republicans had the majority, you would need to get 7 Democrats on your side to vote in order to prevent this or to stop the filibuster once it's happening. And so what this basically means is that senators, by threatening the filibuster, can actually get bills to sort of die, to stop being considered. Because the majority party knows that without 60 out of 100 people on board, that it's a waste of time, it's a wasted effort to try to pass legislation that isn't popular with the rest of the Senate, simply because the cloture requirement is such a high bar. Okay, so in today's Senate, most of the time, the minority party will simply threaten filibuster if this unpalatable, a bill that they don't like comes to the floor. And so functionally, in reality, basically, even though in both chambers it takes 50% of, 50% plus 1, essentially, of either the House or the Senate to pass a bill into law, it's majority rules, even though that's true, functionally, in practice, you really need a 60% majority in the Senate to pass, consequential legislation, simply because of the threat of filibuster and the cloture requirement being 60% and not 50%. So I know that's kind of complicated, but really I think what the whole point of this is that this means that the system is even more gridlocked, is even more difficult to pass legislation, especially in a Congress where you've got polarization, where you've got the Democrats and the Republicans essentially not liking each other very much and very rarely crossing the aisle to vote for each other's bills. Unless you get 60 senators, which, in today's electoral environment is nearly impossible, right? We've got a very polarized country where we've got red states and blue states that tend to sort of balance out. It's very hard to get that super majority of 60% or 60 senators required to pass legislation over the filibuster. Now, there's one other wrinkle that I want to discuss with you before we see an example of a filibuster from recent times, and that is a thing called the nuclear option, which is, I think, something that a lot of people misinterpret, aren't really clear on exactly how it works. A lot of people think that the nuclear option, which was invoked, a little bit earlier in, this past decade, means that the filibuster is gone, that it doesn't apply anymore, or that the cloture requirement of 60% is no longer in force. So that's partially true. The nuclear option was invoked previously, but only as it applies to specific kinds of votes. And so far, what this really applies to is nominees. Remember, if we think back to the Constitution, we know that the power of Congress, one of the checks that they have on the executive branch, on the president, is that the president is able to nominate individuals to serve in various positions like the cabinet, in the executive branch, or also on the Supreme Court. And so the Senate, though, has to go through a confirmation hearing and ultimately vote to confirm that nominee. Now, the nuclear option was invoked when it came to specific kinds of nominees, which means that, in the case of nominating a Supreme Court justice, for example, if the president were to nominate someone, then it would only functionally take 50% of the Senate to confirm that nominee. Whereas, in previous times, you might be able to filibuster that nominee. Now, that filibuster rule, that cloture requirement of 60%, has been reduced to 50%. And so, again, it's much easier now for a slim majority in the Senate to pass on a nominee to actually approve that nominee that the president has submitted. Now, of course, this is something that I wanted to mention explicitly because you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, the Republicans in the present, at the time of this video, do not have a 60% majority in the Senate, yet, they seem pretty clear at this point that they are willing to and excited about nominating a Supreme Court justice to fill the vacancy left by the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. By the way, another aside, if you don't know who Ruth Bader Ginsburg was, and if you are unclear about all of this, first of all, hold on until our discussion of the Supreme Court in just a couple of weeks. But I do recommend that you read some stuff about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life and what she accomplished as a legal mind and also as a woman. I mean, she was really an incredible person. And I think that it's it would be a huge disservice to her memory to not learn something about her. Somebody who, again, was just a tireless champion and advocate for women's rights and for all sorts of different important legal battles in American history, and somebody who will be, I think, remembered fondly even by her opponents as somebody who was truly a remarkable person. So, read some of the obits and read some of the stuff that's happening right now in popular discourse about who Ruth Bader Ginsburg was. But I think we also need to think about the reality of the politics here as well, which is that if the Republicans are interested in nominating somebody before the election, or perhaps confirming someone even before the election, they are technically capable of doing this, specifically because the nuclear option has been invoked in the past, and there's a precedent established that a 60% majority is in fact not required for approving these nominees. Now, again, we can get into a separate discussion about whether the Republicans should do that, especially given the fact that during the Obama administration and the sort of tail end of the 2012 era, we had the sort of inverse sort of issue happening where there was a vacancy in the Supreme Court, and yet Republicans who had the Senate at the time prevented essentially a nominee from the Obama administration from being confirmed. They essentially refused to hold a vote as they were the majority party in the Senate, and they said, you can't have a nominee like this during an election year. We'll let the people decide, essentially. And of course, soon after, 2016 election occurs, and the Trump administration comes in, and we have Neil Gorsuch, who's appointed to the Supreme Court and confirmed by that same Senate, instead of the Democratic nominee, Merrick Garland. And so, again, we're getting way outside of the realm of this, but I just want to really show you the idea that this is an incredibly important rule. It seems like a really minor thing, but it's incredibly important in modern politics today, because depending on whether the Senate votes at the 50% level for something due to the nuclear option, or whether they're trying to pass legislation, which currently the nuclear option does not apply. You can still filibuster bills, bills that could become laws, not nominees, so two separate processes. Because this 60% majority is currently still required to pass things in the Senate, that means that there's a really, really high bar to passing things that are going to be politically, conflicting. For example, you might have been hearing in the news about some of the, different proposals that members of the Senate, depending on who takes the Senate in the 2020 election, would like to do, right? And so a lot of people have been arguing, well, should we use the nuclear option to blow up the filibuster in the next session to sort of rectify some of the things that are happening now. Should Democrats do that, or even should Republicans consider doing this now if they are afraid of losing power in the 2020 election, it becomes a huge debate and a huge controversy, right? So this has been something that you can read op-eds and news articles dating back many years about the nuclear option and whether either party should consider blowing it up. But as it stands, nobody has pushed that button. Nobody has blown up the nuclear option when it comes to passing laws, which means that, again, these politically controversial kinds of bills in a modern Senate where there's a lot of tight senates with very rarely do we have 60 people in the same party who are on board in the Senate, essentially. Very rarely does that happen, and so this means that our system it's very, very difficult to pass anything but the most sort of universally, bipartisan kinds of bills. Truly partisan bills that really take the country in either a distinctly liberal or distinctly conservative direction simply don't get passed because the threat of filibuster is so strong. So let's take a break from the slides right now. I'm going to show you very briefly a clip of an example of a filibuster from recent memory by a guy named Rand Paul. We're going to see that, and then we'll come back in the next video and we'll talk a little bit about how this process works of a bill actually becoming a law in the event that a filibuster doesn't occur, which of course would kill any bill. So follow me on to the next video and enjoy this short clip of a very, very long speaking session by one senator.
The senator from Kentucky.
I rise today to begin to filibuster John Brennan's nomination for the CIA. Without demanding more answers from the president, the problem is we're never getting any more answers. Constitutional rights should be trying to restrain the executive branch. Republican Constitution that the Fifth Amendment does apply to all Americans, and there aren't exceptions. But I thank you very much for the forbearance, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.